Welcome to Wisdom for Life, where we sift through philosophy to find practical advice that you can use in your everyday life. Hi, I'm Dan Hayes. I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Greg Sadler, and today we're going to talk about
what's in a name, the meanings of philosophical schools and ideas. And this is one we've been wanting to get to for a while because we've brought this up in the past with some of these philosophical schools. There's a lot of terms that get used in philosophy, and the original meanings of them wound up being, let's say, overridden by other meanings. And, in some cases it's a school or a movement or a method. So we're going to look at, Stoicism and Cynicism and Epicureanism. And in other cases, it could be things like an idea or argument like Aristotle's virtuous mean or Occam's razor, what we could call philosophical constructs. And we're not going to do those today. We're just going to focus on the first. And I think if there's enough interest, we'll do a show about how people have gotten mixed up about these philosophical constructs. And we're not actually going to say that it's wrong to use words in an ordinary way, as opposed to, as they say, ivory tower academics or things like that. And we want to try to avoid those rather silly dichotomies where people are like, I'm street smart or I'm book smart. That's not particularly helpful. But we do think that it is good to know when people are using terms for philosophy, like on a philosophy radio show, what those terms actually mean. So that's how we got the idea to do an entire show about this. And, we'll talk about what the original meaning of the term is and where it came from, and what people mean by it oftentimes in the present. And it can be interesting to reconstruct how we went from A to B. And so we're going to be using definitions that will be coming from dictionary.com, but you could pick any other dictionary and you'd get similar definitions of pragmatism or utilitarianism. And so we're going to, hit on a bunch of these. I'm not quite sure how many of these we'll necessarily get to, but we're going to try to hit the biggest confusing ones. Is there anything you want to add about that, Dan, before we jump in?
So, there's this, obviously, language changes over time as people use it, and thus they get new meanings. That's perfectly fine. But just as if you work in a specialized field, you might use terms that are only applicable within that field. Also within philosophy, if we're talking about a certain topic, then we have a different definition because of the context. And it doesn't mean that we have to say, one word can only mean one thing. Words can have multiple meanings, and both meanings can be valid concerning the context. So, I guess 86 within a restaurant context means we're out of that thing. That it's entered a little bit into the general vernacular, but it's definitely more a niche thing. And if you said something and they don't have restaurant experience, they don't know what the heck you're talking about.
That's an interesting one, and I'm willing to bet that the way that it's entered the popular, linguistic sphere is because there are all of these cuisine shows, let's call them. Mm-hmm. Some of them are reality shows, like I remember back when there was Iron Chef and what is the one that we just had it here in Milwaukee? The competition with chefs, and they watch them and make them
Top
jump.
Chef or something.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, and then there's shows about chefs too, right? And kitchens, and just like there were shows about police departments or hospitals, and people would learn a lot of the lingo through that, and sometimes get it wrong because the writers aren't always necessarily totally immersed in that world, and they play up certain things. So, yeah, that's a kind of interesting contemporary example.
Yeah. I guess the main thing I'm trying to point out is that, we're not trying to force a definition. It's just, within proper context, we mean one thing, and in popular context, we might mean another thing, and let's make sure that we have our I's dotted here.
If only we had the power to force our definitions onto people through radio airwaves. Wouldn't that be amazing?
Yeah. Well, I guess doing this and discussing the actual or like the more historic definitions of these things can, in our usage of it, slightly move the needle towards a different definition of these words.
Yeah, I think you're right. Although I don't know whether it's a perceptible moving of the needle or not.
Probably not.
I mean, maybe a few people hearing this, it'll be helpful for them because they'll be like, "Oh, I didn't know that it means this," and I've always been using it with this more contemporary popular sense. So let's turn to the first one.
All right,
Epicurean.
So, Epicurean, from Epicureanism. And so we've got our definition, this popular definition: fond of luxury, or adapted to it, or indulgence in sensual pleasures, having luxurious tastes or habit, especially in eating and drinking. This always reminds me of hedonism bot from Futurama, and he's, this idea of like this hedonist, and he's
laying
permanently
down.
reclined. His whole body is built in a reclined position and is gilded and always has grapes to be eaten. Think of the worst, Caligula impersonations in film and stage.
Am I remembering right that he occasionally gets oiled as well?
Oh, yes.
Okay, yeah.
He's like, drench me in oil. Oh, yes.
I've seen a magazine that's all devoted to like food and wine, and I think it was called Epicure. And you could buy it at newsstands, and that's the contemporary understanding of what it means to be an Epicurean. You're knowledgeable, you're kind of a connoisseur, but you're also into all that. I mean, nowadays we have that term foodie, right? Would that be similar to being an Epicurean?
I've heard people just calling, to be an Epicurean is to be a foodie. That's just synonymous.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't know how widespread that is, but yeah, that's definitely, or Epicurean tastes.
It is interesting because you mentioned hedonism bot. So Epicureanism is one kind of classical hedonism. And I don't think that when we use the term today, we do tend to mean like food and drink, maybe tobacco as well, people who have cigars or, with cognac, but we don't use it for like people who get too many massages, and we definitely don't use it for sex stuff and say, oh, what an epicure. They're always having sex with people,
Yeah. Why is it reduced down to eating and drinking? I do not know. But that's just how language goes.
I mean, historically, now, of course, there were some Epicureans who did have sex because obviously, it's hard to keep a movement going without having any kids. But Epicurus himself didn't, and he seemed to think that sexual pleasure would get us in more trouble than it was worth,
Yeah.
And you can think about
especially the idea of hedonism within Epicureanism was like, yes, like what feels good is good, but the idea wasn't to have these giant peaks. It was a smooth. They would describe it as a calm lake. That's the evenness of your enjoyment of life that you should be aspiring to. And I guess I would say that sex is usually quite a high, pleasurable experience, and so that might have been, at least in his mind, outside, or like a peak that would be outside of what it should be gone towards.
Another way in which the classical understanding of Epicureanism differs from the contemporary way would have to do with expense, right? So Epicurus reputedly could be happy with like a little pot of cheese, his favorite kind, whatever it was, we don't know what it was, and some bread, and you're like, what? Bread and cheese and water? That's it? No wine? No, relishes? No meat? No, 14-course meal? And yeah, I mean, that's what he thought was actually going to be more pleasant for you, in part because then you don't get like diseases from eating too much, doesn't cost you much, doesn't take
Not
it
getting
off.
hung over.
Exactly, yeah.
Like
yeah.
there's all these like, eat a whole bunch of really rich foods and then you kind of feel terrible later. Like it was good in the moment, but that would be against the idea of the Epicurean hedonism. The overall happiness are like, positive feeling, and
Yeah.
excessive eating is actually against that.
So how did we wind up with something? It's not quite the opposite, but you could say at least like within the realm of food and drink, it's at an opposite end of the spectrum than where the original Epicureans were. How did we get there?
It's a destruction or disintegration of the nuanced take on hedonism. If you just, it's like it's got elementary school appreciation of like, things feel good or good, and then things feel bad or bad, and you've taken off all the nuance and you've taken off all the discussion, and it just turns into like, I just want to feel good all the time, and well, if you're gonna do that, just go do heroin, but like.
You heard it, folks. Just go do some smack.
It's gonna be bad for you later, but you'll feel good
real soon. Actually,
it's been reported.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of think that some of the change also happened because, if there was anybody that almost everybody in antiquity and the Middle Ages could agree was bad, it was the Epicureans, because they didn't value virtue as virtue. They said, well, virtue's great. You do want to be temperate and courageous and just and wise, but basically so it gives you pleasure,
right.
and prevents pain. And so a lot of people suspected that, and Epicurean became kind of a word that could be like associated just with hedonism and pleasure seeking, So if you've got it wrong, you're in good company. I think most people today understand it not in relation to Epicurus and his teachings, which, by the way, we've lost most of,
Yeah, although with the Scrolls of Herculaneum, we might have some more.
Yeah.
Because that's an Epicurean library.
We might even, supposedly he wrote a book on nature that we call it 30 books, but these are actually scrolls. So that'd be a huge composition. Maybe we'll find that there.
I was just actually looking this up on the other day and trying to figure out how long a scroll is on average.
Okay.
And between 3 and 10 meters of roll, and doing some kind of back of the napkin math on what that meant, and using I think it was one of the Gospels, that's being like about a 10-meter long scroll.
Okay.
And found out that like 3 meters is about 20 pages, 10 meters is about 60 pages.
Okay.
So a scroll, sometimes referred to as books, as we like put them into what are the newer bound books. There's a better word for those.
A codex or labellum.
A codex, thank you.
Yeah.
That in a regular popular print book nowadays, that'd be about 20 to 60 pages.
It's interesting. Now we're going to go off on a complete tangent here.
Yeah.
When people talk about the Bible was never a singular term. It means literally the books, ta biblia. It's plural. And before they came out with the kind of books that we're used to, you would actually carry your scrolls around in a bag. And so, if you want to, and you would read the book of so-and-so, like the Gospel of Matthew or this letter by Paul. And it's interesting because we see all the way to Augustine's time. So we're talking about, 4th century AD. They're still doing that. They don't have like a common, everybody's got exactly the same collection. You might have like, some extra books or not have the books that everybody else does. And people would sometimes get worked up about that, but it wasn't so solidified in the way that now we just sort of take for granted, I mean,
Oh yeah.
imagine if like we're talking about like a sci-fi or fantasy series, and like so let's take Lord of the Rings, which is originally actually is supposed to be 6 books, but not 6 volumes, and you had number 1, number 3, number 4 and 5, and that's it. Be like, well, I don't have the whole story, but it's still pretty good, And maybe you'd go and borrow 6 from your friends so you can find out how it all ends, and you'd find another friend who's got 2, and you borrow or even steal his copy so you can figure out what's going on at this point in the story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and there's been a number of different developments of the Bible over the ages. I think the Catholics have an extra book that's not in most Protestant Bibles as well.
Oh, not just one, a whole bunch. But it's not just the Catholics; it's everybody who's not a Protestant. So the Orthodox, the Coptic Christians, the Syriac Christians, the Protestants are the outliers.
Yeah, and then it's very interesting what is considered canon or not within the canon of a particular church.
And, to a certain extent, even with, we're going to talk about Stoicism in a little bit. Which authors do we count as being most centrally important? Like, does Cicero get in there? Because he's not a Stoic, but there's an awful lot that if we want to know about Stoicism, we have to go to him, and he liked the Stoics,
Right.
These issues of canon are not just for religious people, you could say.
Oh, yeah. And people get very up in arms about it. Actually, it's caused whole wars if we want to talk about like religions, but like at least in any sort of group, you can see this happening nowadays with like fandom, Star Wars or whatever.
What counts as canon, right?
Yeah,
that is an interesting idea. We should do something on fandom sometime, because there's a lot that philosophers, they didn't have fandoms back when, say, Aristotle was writing, but a lot of the things that Aristotle says, like about anger, could apply directly to beefs between people in fandoms. So maybe we should actually do a show about that.
So you feeling a little cynical here, Craig?
Yeah, so that's another term that gets used quite differently today, and actually going back a good ways than it was originally. So here's the dictionary definition. A person who believes that only selfishness motivates human actions and who disbelieves in or minimizes selfless acts or disinterested points of view. And I think that's pretty much what people mean when they talk about being cynical. There's a couple other nice glosses: distrusting or disparaging the motives of others, like or characteristic of a cynic; showing contempt for accepted standards of morality or honesty by one's actions, especially by actions that exploit the scruples of others. Now, some of that does sound a little bit like classical cynicism. The first cynic, there's a little bit of a scholarly dispute about this. Was Antisthenes the first cynic, or was Diogenes? I don't think we have to worry about that too much here. Antisthenes was a student of Socrates, and he took from Socrates the idea that virtue is the only good, and that you should have as simple a life as possible. And that didn't actually mean like wandering around like Diogenes did with just a staff and a knapsack or wallet and a cloak. But Antisthenes lived in what would be nowadays the equivalent of a cheap studio apartment. He drank cheap wine. He would go to people's parties and enjoy good wine, and they'd be like, that must be really, quite a switch for you. And he'd be like, yeah, I mean, it's nice. I mean, I'm really free because I can drink the cheap stuff too, but I can also appreciate the good stuff. He interestingly had sex with women, and he would have sex with women who are considered unattractive, in part because he was like, well, it doesn't take as much work, and it's nice for them, it's nice for me. So he had this very interesting approach to things. And there were cynics who were married. Crates, the student of Diogenes, actually marries Hipparchia, and they live a cynical lifestyle together. But it wasn't about saying, ooh, everybody's a bad person, or distrusting everybody. As a matter of fact, they called themselves the heralds of God, meaning that they're announcing, the message. Everybody needs to be good people. So in a way, it sort of like with the Epicureans, the term comes to take on a very different meaning. And I think that part of it is because the Cynics did typically say that most people were, in fact, badly off when it came to things. They had mistaken ideas about what's important, what's not. And they did reject social conventions. They called that debasing the currency. But they didn't do it just to be jerks. They did it because they thought people put way too much emphasis on things that don't really matter,
Can you give us a historical context of debasing the currency and how it works in here?
Oh, well, so in a literal sense, and it's not quite clear, but it seems like Diogenes and maybe his father got in trouble for actually taking the coins and like doing something to them, maybe shaving a bit of the silver off, and then, making new coins or something like that, or minting their own kind of coins. And it was used as a metaphor for like taking any sort of social convention. So think about going to a funeral, right? There's some things you shouldn't do at a funeral, like, rest your drink on top of the dead person's head. Or crack a lot of jokes about them at the funeral. I mean, you can do that if you really know them well, or people invite you to do that. But usually we see those as no-nos, right?
Right.
But if you're a cynic, you could be like, why do you care about this dead body so much? There's no person here, Why did you even bother to embalm them? Why not just burn them up? It's cheaper, Have a little get together, talk about what's good about them. Maybe you could have a picture there instead of having that corpse laid out. I mean, I don't know of any cynics who actually did this, but that could be an example of it. And, we could say, well, how did this term come to mean something really different? And it seems to have changed its meaning during the early modern period and comes to mean what we nowadays think it signifies, which is just somebody who doesn't like other people. It's more like a misanthrope, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's easy to see like the jump there from like the stories, especially of Diogenes being like debasing the currency and going out and like kind of like doing these things that are very counter to convention.
I think I know the one you're going to bring up.
Oh, I wasn't going to bring up any, but I can.
You may as well.
Okay,
it's always good for a laugh.
Well, I guess he would pleasure himself in public whenever he felt like it, because it's like, well, a dog would do it. Why shouldn't I?
Yeah, he also would say, if only I could cure my hunger by rubbing my stomach like this.
Yes. And did other things like, bring out like a lantern and shine it in people's faces and says, I'm looking for a good man.
With the implication, you're not one.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, like, he kind of sounds like a dick, but, like, what are you going to do? And that's the point of the jumping between, this misanthropic person from someone who's actually trying to jostle someone out of being just okay with the way things are.
Yeah. I should mention, because that reminds me of something. There's this early Cynic school, and then they kind of disappear from the scene, and they come up again in the Roman Empire. And there was a Roman emperor he's very, very late. He's called Julian the Emperor, Julian the Apostate, and he's got a discourse to the Cynic, and he's criticizing all these bums who pretend to be cynics, who just, get themselves the outfit. The traditional Cynic thing was you have a staff that you walk with, you have like a wallet, and then you have this cloak that you can use as like a blanket, keep yourself warm and all of that. And they would just go around and beg and, talk smack to people. And he's like, listen, you're not real cynics. Here's what a real cynic would look like. You're not it. Knock it off, So, I suppose there were probably always some people who were exploiting the Cynic name to kind of get away with stuff. I think a prime example of this in our current time, or not quite current time, would be somebody like Charles Bukowski. You know, he was kind of a bum. I mean, he was also a writer, but he lived kind of like a bum, and he'd deliberately tick people off and do kind of goofy stuff, and he thought that was like, how he ought to behave. He's putting the lie to fake, phony society. And I mean, I've read Bukowski. I know a lot of people who are into him. I've never read him and been like, oh my gosh, this guy is really philosophically astute. I should live his life. And the people that are really into him kind of act like him. So
yeah, it always reminds me of someone cosplaying as someone in a motorcycle gang. It's like you buy your Harley and you go ride on the weekends.
Yeah.
But every other day you go and I'll put on your suit and go to the office. And I was like, you're not actually living this lifestyle. You just pretend to do it on the weekends because it's kind of fun. And it's totally fun to go out and kind of screw with people a little bit. But is that your life? Do you actually have a philosophical foundation for these things, or is it just to get someone's goat?
And the ancient cynics would say, if you're doing stuff just for social appearances, the whole realm of the social, you got your priorities screwed up. So it's kind of anti-cynic to do that sort of thing. Yeah.
Well, I'm feeling rather stoic. I don't want to show any emotion or anything about what we're talking about here. Just keep my stiff upper lip and maybe fondly look at my bust of Spock on my shelf.
You're hitting a lot of the stereotypes.
Yeah. So obviously we were talking about Stoicism and what is to be a Stoic, and how it's been changed over the years. And obviously the popular definition of these is someone with a calm, astute fortitude. Especially in facing your troubles or loss, not giving into one's emotions, and can endure pain and hardship without showing their feelings or complaining. And so this is an affect and not actually the philosophy that is there. And so as well as it's an incorrect affect for the Stoics, because the Stoics are historically known as rather happy individuals, and you don't ever think of Spock as laughing it up. It's a joke. They did it on the newest Star Trek, and they had young Spock, and he was laughing, and it was weird because Spock isn't supposed to do that.
Wasn't there an episode in the original series where I forget what happened, but Spock was laughing kind of maniacally? I think he was maybe there was an alien mind force over him, making him do stuff that was so uncharacteristic.
Yeah, vaguely remember that. I also think of Data and TNG, and there's certain episodes where he's showing all this emotion, and I guess Data's definitely your Spock stand-in for that series. But obviously this is a modern thing. It changed in the 14th and 15th century. As there was a still a remembrance of Stoicism, specifically in English. It changed from this the idea of what the philosophy is, which is a virtue-based ethic, and it's not that you should not show emotions, you should not be disturbed by external things, and being able to have the internal fortitude and the tools at hand to not let emotions take you away. Control you. You should be the one that's in control. And also not to be emotionless, to be so well associated on understanding your emotions that you know what they actually mean instead of trying to suppress them. It's the opposite of what is often referred to as Stoic nowadays.
Yeah, I think looking at literature in English, and so maybe it's like this in other languages. By the 19th century, the term mostly just means what we're talking about now. This not the philosophy, although they were still reading Marcus Aurelius every once in a while, but this like stiff upper lip idea, not showing emotions, not succumbing to pain. And I think the lowercase s thing becomes really prevalent by then. So, without people knowing anything about the philosophy, they're reading some of the literature. Robert Louis Stevenson uses the term this way in the 19th century. If you were like only reading that, you'd be like, aha, that's what it means to be Stoic. And so by the 20th century and the 21st century, it's used of like football players playing through being hurt, or, it's just used as a synonym for being emotionless.
Right. And once again, the opposite therein.
Yeah, I mean, to be a Stoic means to take joy in the right things, to love, to feel affection. It's not to... I think another term that people use that's synonymous is like detachment or insulating oneself off. A Stoic isn't disconnected from everybody else. There's this whole notion that we're part of a larger totality that includes other people, and we should be kind and good to them.
It's kind of funny. Like, Epicureanism is much more detached than Stoicism, as well as like.
In its classic form, yeah.
Yeah, in its classic form, like they, just go and hang out in the walled garden and try to, wall out the things that might disturb you from the outside world.
Yeah.
And Stoicism is all about how do you keep your head, how do you keep calm and do the right thing while you are interacting with your fellow man in the world. The world's going to jostle you and push you around, and sometimes you're going to get splashed, or worse, how do you deal with that real world if you don't have these nice, walls with the nice wine and the nice food, and you to retreat away from all the hubbub of the world?
I heard a great talk by Margaret Graver, who has a book called Stoicism and Emotion, at Stoicon 2017, where she was the keynote speaker, and she contrasted the three schools that we've just looked at: Epicureanism, Cynicism, and Stoicism. And she was talking about exactly what you were bringing up. How do you deal with your emotions? And with the Cynics, it's all of this like hugging statues to toughen yourself up. You're not going to let things get the better of you. In a way, the classic Cynics are a little bit more like what we nowadays call Stoics, when we use the term in a very different sense. Whereas like you were saying, the older Stoics, they were like, well, you actually got to understand your emotions. You got to understand why you feel the way you do. You can't just shove it down inside. That's not going to be a successful strategy. You can't just toughen yourself up. You need to figure out what really matters and why you're so screwed up.
Yeah, it's interesting that Stoicism is kind of this middle way between the two of them.
Right. Yeah. So let's talk about another ancient school that has come to mean something really different in the present. If you say that somebody's a skeptic, right? So here's the dictionary definition: a person who questions the validity or authenticity of something purporting to be factual. And then here's another one: a person who maintains a doubting attitude as towards values, plans, statements, or the character of others. And then there's a third one: a person who doubts the truth of a religion. We're getting a little bit more specific here, especially Christianity or of important elements of it. So that's the way we use the term in the present. And I would say that's quite correct. There is like an online skeptic community. They even have magazines and things like that. The third definition being not so much anti-religion, but saying, hey, the claims that religions make, they're not really well backed up. But the ancient philosophy, it did have doubt involved, right? and they were questioning things, but it's not about questioning for its own sake. Skeptikoi means seeker, somebody who actually wants to find the truth. They're just not convinced that anyone actually has it yet, and so they want evidence, they want arguments, they want to test the things. And very often, so here's one way in which contemporary skeptics might be very different than ancient skeptics. If you were an ancient skeptic, one of your key techniques was to take arguments coming from other people, other schools, and present them and then present the case against them. Now, what does this mean? You actually have to know your stuff. If you want to say that the Epicureans have stuff wrong, you have to study the Epicureans, and you don't just approach them saying, how can I undermine these people? You say, maybe they've actually got it right. Let's see. And then let's see where we can find some criticisms. How could the Epicureans and the Stoics play off against each other? That's what the ancient skeptics actually did. One contemporary skeptic, and when I say contemporary, I mean from the 20th century, this guy, Odo Macquart, who actually identified as a classical skeptic. He was a German philosopher. He called this, instead of divide and conquer, divide and flee. You put two dogmatic positions against each other, and that gives you a kind of freedom to go in between them and find your own place. And I don't actually know how the term wound up meaning this just, always questioning, always doubting sort of thing. Somewhere along the line, I guess, there were some extreme skeptics in ancient philosophy. There was this guy, Pyrrho, who apparently, according to the stories, he doubted so much stuff that his students would have to keep him from walking off of a cliff, because he'd say, I don't know if it's going to kill me, Mm-hmm. So that's pretty extreme. But that's not the way most skeptics in ancient philosophy, at least, were,
I found it interesting in conversations, especially philosophical conversations, and when someone just assumes that if you present an argument, that you automatically mean that argument.
Yeah.
And it's like I can put on an Epicurean hat, and I can talk about Epicureanism, or I can put on a utilitarian hat, and I can talk about utilitarianism and the steps that we come to these things. Doesn't mean that I think it's exactly right, or it's the way to go forward. And this whole divide and flee is sometimes funny to see how people react to that.
Yeah. I actually get people who get mad because I've done videos on so many different philosophers. And usually, it makes perfect sense. They would know me from one set of videos. So maybe they see me doing videos on Aristotle, and they're like, oh, cool, this guy, he's explaining Aristotle. It kind of makes sense to me. And then they'll see me doing videos on, say, Nietzsche. And they'll be like, what the hell? How can you believe this stuff if you believe this stuff over here? And I'll be like, how do you know I believe any of it? I'm not actually saying that I agree with Aristotle. I'm just presenting his position, and I'm doing so in a competent, fairly charitable way. And I do the same thing with Nietzsche, and I do the same thing with, other thinkers who are opposed to both of these guys. Why wouldn't we do that? And if my students in classes don't know where I actually sit, I think that's a good thing,
Right. Because
they can make up their own minds,
Right, I get stuck in the whole essentialists and existentialists, and we'll get to that in a moment. But just do
you want to jump to them right away?
Yeah, I was just how these are diametrically opposed.
Yeah, very
the
different
basis of the
terms,
world and how they understand it. And
let's do that.
All right, so existentialists. So the current meaning of it is of or relating to existence. as in a existential threat, as in like climate change or nuclear war or an asteroid, are existential threats to humanity, at least as a single planet system at the moment. It also in logic is affirming or implying the existence of a thing. That's the second definition. But like if we're talking about the philosophy of itself, it is a reaction to essentialist philosophies that says that there is an essence for like who you are and where you ought to be in the world, and what is right or wrong exists out there, and then you are born into this like milieu or this existent philosophical like universal order, versus the existentialist, which is something along the lines of one is born, they exist, and then they create their meaning, that the existence precedes essence, and that we then create our own meaning and values in that world instead of reversed.
It's kind of interesting because if you think about, like you mentioned, like an asteroid hitting, right? I mean, the odds of that are pretty low, but if it does happen, we're screwed. If it's a big asteroid, everybody's dead. And not just all of us, but most of the other animals and plants, and there'll be some sort of life that comes back on the planet, unless it's so big that it like hits the core, and then Earth is completely done. And you could actually have existential, in the philosophical sense, dread about that. I mean, you'd be silly to. I think the existentialists would say you're much more likely going to be killed by nuclear war, climate change, or stuff like that, in terms of like massive catastrophes or some sort of crazy virus outbreak that we didn't think about, probably because we create some virus to like kill another virus and then it gets out of hand. So you could have dread, you could have angst about that, but more often it's more like thinking about how the world is going to go on, and any trace of your existence will be gone 100 years from now, even if you made an impact on other people. Like, we'll take my videos, right? Let's say YouTube is actually around 100 years from now. Yeah, sure, there'll be some guy talking about stuff, in a classroom in front of a chalkboard, but that ain't me, right? That's just some avatar. I mean, even if we make, as we've chatted about before, kind of joking and then putting together some more serious things. If we put together like, use an AI to create a Sadler bot, that still isn't me. And what, the distinction, the difference between those, that's something that would fit into existential philosophy, but it doesn't have anything to do with like existential threats or stuff like that.
And because like existentialism is such a relatively new philosophy, especially compared to all the other ones that we've spoken about recently. Like there's a short timeline from us like talking about Kierkegaard or Nietzsche or Sartre or Simone, any of these great thinkers. That it's just like a simple like transposing of like people like existential. Its base word is existence, and thus like you just ignore everything else.
I mean, it's interesting.
It seems that like
the earliest
a number of these have this issue of like, hey, there's a base word that I understand, so it means that.
Yeah. I mean, the earliest use, I think, of existere in Latin is not for being, it's for like standing out, sort of like emerging, something that draws our attention and interest. But of course, then pretty early on, it starts to mean just what we call existence, something is or it isn't. Yeah. Well, let's see how many others we can get to. So here's one that I see people using in all sorts of ways that are different than the original sense. Pragmatic, right? So the the dictionary definition is of or relating to a practical point of view or practical considerations. And that's not wrong. Another term, treating historical phenomena with special reference to their causes, antecedent conditions, and results. So that's more specialized. That's about like history. And interestingly, in this case, that sense, that contemporary sense, is like the very oldest sense of the term. It's first occurring in the early modern period, around 1580, and it's coming from the Latin pragmaticus, from Greek pragmatikos, which means practical, having to do with business, having to do with your actions or things like that. But there is a movement, a philosophical movement that starts here in America that is called pragmatism. And there's actually kind of a funny backstory about this. So the guy who starts it is Charles Sanders Peirce, who's kind of a weird guy anyway. He's sort of an outlier. He's not, he is doing writing in journals and stuff like that, but he's also got a day job. And he creates let's call it a perspective, and he calls it pragmatism. And it's not just all about results or anything like that, but it does have a sense of, the truth of something is going to be what its practical, real world effects are going to be. And William James comes along, and then he decides to use this term in a somewhat different way, but still a philosophical way, different than what Peirce was doing. And it bothers Peirce so much, because Peirce can see that their points of view are in fact different, that Peirce says, all right, I'm not calling my stuff pragmatism anymore. You can have it. I'm going to call what I do pragmaticism. And it's such an ugly word, this is what he said, that nobody will steal it from me. So William James gets to keep pragmatism, right? And then he kind of popularizes it. And, James finds people in Europe who like this point of view, particularly in Italy, but also in France. And then it comes to, like, there's a lot of Americans who take it on. Some come up with their own names for it, like John Dewey doesn't call himself a pragmatist, he calls himself an instrumentalist, but he's a pragmatist. He's within that tradition. And so it doesn't mean James was really good at coining phrases, the cash value of an idea, right? When you hear something like that, you're like, oh, okay, so it's just about like reducing everything to what we can do with things, or practical effects. And that isn't what James thought at all. I mean, he's got lectures on pragmatism, but in the popular mindset, that basically is where people are. So they're like, we need to be really pragmatic about this. And usually when they say something like that, what they mean is we're going to break the rules, or we're going to violate people's rights, or we're going to put aside any, other moral considerations. We just need to just do business. And William James would say, well, you're not being very practical, because, keeping yourself out of prison, that might be a very practical thing to do, or maintaining a good set of relationships with people, say in the workplace, right? That might be very practical. So what count? I think oftentimes when people use the word pragmatist now, what they mean is it's useful, it's practical, and we put aside any other important values, when really it's about how do we realize, for the philosophical sense, it's really about how do we actually realize the values that we have.
Would you please elucidate the daylight between pragmatism and pragmatism?
Pragmatism? Yeah, I'm kind of fuzzy on that right now, and I will actually throw kind of a funny little quip in there. From the pragmatic point of view, if there isn't any real distinction there, then you may as well just call them by the same term, right?
Right.
I think that
distinction without a difference.
Exactly. I think that if I remember right, Peirce wanted to insist more on how you verify these matters. James is a psychologist. Peirce is very interested in scientific processes and stuff like that, as is James, but I don't actually have like a ready to mind easy way of explaining it, unfortunately.
We also touched about this on our shows on truth, and we talked about pragmatic truth.
The pragmatic theory of truth, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so once again, it's like this evaluation of ideas on their practical applications, and so a pragmatic theory of truth is that which the outcomes are actually useful.
It's often summed up as truth is what works. And then the problem with that is you could say, well, do you mean that like telling everybody that, for example, Nazism is the right way to go? I mean, it did produce a society that worked for a while. Must be true then, Mm-hmm. Now, forgetting the fact that, okay, can ideologies really be true in any real sense? Maybe that's a bigger problem there. You could say, well, I mean, it didn't last, there
Mm-hmm.
wasn't any 1,000-year Reich. It didn't take long for it to fall apart. And even if they hadn't started a world war, it their whole economy would have collapsed.
Right.
So, you can respond to things like that. But I do think that a lot of people, when they are talking about being pragmatic, to go back to one of the earlier things, what they often mean is being cynical, not in the classic sense, but in the contemporary sense. Just put aside all these moral considerations. If it makes you money, then it works. If it makes you feel good, then it works. But, the actual pragmatist would say, well, how long does that work for?
Right.
And do you have any evidence that it actually makes you feel better?
Mm-hmm.
So
it's like the question of is it will eternally work? And this is actually one of those things that like a lot of the ancient schools dealt with. It's like, okay, this thing works now, or this thing feels good now, but what are the consequences? What are the does getting that new car make you feel good forever or just for the moment? And what is actually has the staying power, and what is actually good in the long term?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, so many people engage in retail therapy that they don't think about the actual practical consequences for their credit card accounts.
Or just our entire economy being built on that type of idea, and how much stuff you're throwing away. Really quick, going back to Nazism and fascism, that you're going back to like the definitions of Umberto Eco. One of them is that fascism also always has to have an in-group and an out-group.
Yeah.
And once you destroy the out-group, you must create a new in-group or a new in-group and out-group from the old in-group. And so it's constantly this whittling away of the in-group because it's such a core part of the ideology.
Yeah, which means that maybe overall it's impractical in the long run. I mean, we could talk about a lot of different perspectives as being, one word we could use is unsustainable, right? Mm-hmm. They're not able to be, they can work for a short time, mm-hmm. but they can't work long term. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And also the question of who does it work for?
That's true. Yeah.
Like, slavery is great for the masters.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually a great segue into utilitarianism, right? Mm-hmm. Because you could say, well, there's more slaves than masters, so from a utilitarian perspective, not so good overall, right?
Yeah. This gets to the what is that? The repugnant conclusion. If you have like more and more people, like the whole idea of utilitarianism is the most good for the most amount of people. But if you get more and more people, and then but their goodness is less and less, but there's more and more of them.
Yeah.
The total amount of goodness is increased, even though the average for each person is less and less.
See, I think if you look at like actual utilitarian philosophy, There's all sorts of objections that people make. And then when you look at what utilitarians in their classical formulations, like, and Bentham and John Stuart Mill and some of the other earlier people, they were like, yeah, we know about that. Here's how you handle that. Right. Here's how you understand whether pleasure or pain or however else you want to measure utility is created. It is interesting, though, with you mentioning that, there was a guy who in the game Sim City, where you can create, cities that like have natural disasters and stuff like that, he managed to create a gigantic city. And it does like measure the people in the city, what their satisfaction is. And he managed to like max out the number of people in the city. And I don't remember exactly how he did it, but they were all miserable, And so he was only focusing on like how many of them you could possibly have, right? But I think with utilitarianism, a lot of people, they don't think about the moral theory. They hear the word utilitarian. And I've seen my own colleagues in philosophy, sometimes those who teach ethics, use it this way. Yeah. They're like, utilitarian means only about utility or usefulness, not beauty or ornamentation. So something is very utilitarian if it's like my coffee mug here, which is just white. It's got a shape, it's set up so it stays flat. It holds my tea or my coffee. No ornamentation. Doesn't look bad, doesn't look good, but that's it. No frills. And a utilitarian doesn't necessarily have to be against ornamentation. It might be possible to make people happier by putting them in nice apartments that have Art Deco themes or something like that, if that is what produces more utility,
Right. So once again, just like existentialism or existential, utilitarian, it seems that once again it's a, hey, I know what utility is, and then I'm going to ignore any of the philosophy that's associated with it.
That's a good parallel. Yeah. So it's the term that is the root of the philosophical term comes to be dissociated from the philosophical system or movement.
Right. It's very much like, hey, some guy heard someone talking about this thing, didn't actually know what it was, and it's like, oh, I can sound smart by saying, oh, it's utilitarian.
Yeah. I mean, usually when people will say that something is utilitarian, it's not a good thing. They're saying, oh, it's, it so works. Basic. Yeah, it's cheap, it's nice, but it's not so nice. It would be nicer if it had a little bit of decoration.
Mm-hmm. Well, the cynics love it, though.
That's true, yeah. But there's connections between these, I think you can say, in the contemporary senses.
Yeah, but with that, I think we need to end the episode with the words of John Locke. So difficult it is to show the various meanings and imperfections of words when we have nothing else but words to do it with.